Human beings are members of a whole, in creation of one essence and soul. If one member is afflicted with pain, other members uneasy will remain. If you've got no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain. This poem was written over 8 centuries ago by the great Iranian poet Sadi Shirazi. Today it decorates the gate of the United Nations building entrance in New York City. It calls for the breaking of barriers, something that I deeply care about, and the reason I'm here to speak with you all tonight. I was born in Tehran, Iran, a few years after the 1979 revolution, and right in the middle of the Iran-Iraq War. My father is half American, and my grandmother, who's American, lived with us at the time. The Islamic leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, had just overthrown 2,500 years of continuous Persian monarchy under the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was supported by the United States government. One of my earliest memories was hearing the followers of the revolution chant, "Death to America," in the streets. I was around 6 years old at the time, and their chant kind of sounded like a song to me. Not understanding the meaning of the words, my brother and I would sing along sometimes. And one day I even had the bright idea to go and join them. Thankfully, my father stopped us and pulled us aside. He pointed at my grandmother, who was sitting in the corner, and said, "What are you doing? Do you want your grandma to die?" I was a little confused because I hadn't made the connection. And he continued, "Well, your grandma's American, and there's people just like you, me, and her living over there. We're all human beings, and you're even part American." My eyes filled up with tears at the thought of my grandma dying and for understanding the full meaning of my hateful words. I didn't realize it at the time, but what my father had done was humanize Americans for me. He'd also opened up my eyes to the separation and fear that exists in the world. After that day, whenever I experienced any kind of hate or heard any death chants by the Islamic extremists, I knew that it came from a place of ignorance and fear. Yes, there's some people who still chant those things, but there are many Iranians who do not support the antics and beliefs of the government. In fact, many Iranians live under fear and are victims of a coup regime. They wish for nothing more than freedom and basic human rights, just like everyone else in the world. I was forced to hide behind a scarf when I was growing up in Iran during the Islamic regime, and every facet of my social life was restricted. My childhood years were spent with the increasing apprehension of revealing my core identity, and my freedom and passion for self-expression were frowned upon. I lived under fear, like many others in my country, of what tomorrow would bring. At the age of 17, I was presented with a unique opportunity. Because my grandma was American, I was allowed to travel to the United States and obtain my American passport and get dual citizenship. But because there was no American embassy in Iran, I would have to come to America to do so before the age of 18. So, excited by all the freedoms and opportunities that America had to offer, I packed up all my bags and came to the United States, leaving most of my family behind. America was not what I thought it was going to be like. All I really had seen of America was from Hollywood movies. So I learned pretty quickly that I'd created this illusion of America and the American dream, and that you still have to work really hard for what you want, and things were not as easy and simple as they seemed in the movies. It was hard for me to fit in. I looked different, and my name was and is not exactly the easiest to pronounce. When I told people I was from Iran, they either didn't know where that was, or if they did, they associated it with the Death to America slogans, the hostage situation that happened in 1979, or the death chants. So I found myself educating people a lot about the difference between the people and the government, and humanizing the people, separate from the government, something that my father did for me when I was a little girl with Americans. Most people were pretty surprised to learn a little bit more about Iran. For example, the fact that we have snowy mountains and one of the best ski resorts in the world, where I grew up skiing every year of my life. That we have streets, buildings, structures, and modern architecture. Most of all, they were surprised to see how normal Iranian people are. And as they got to know me, they started to see how much we have in common. I was starting to feel like maybe I was beginning to belong, that I could make a real difference, maybe one person at a time. That fear and anxiety that lived inside of me was beginning to fade and was being replaced with hope. A few years after my arrival in America, 2 planes crashed into the World Trade Center in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. I was working in the lobby of a library at the time, and there was a TV there blasting images of the attack and speculating on who the terrorists might be. Iraq was mentioned a few times, along with a few other Middle Eastern countries. And we were all in shock. Everybody was glued to the TV, like the rest of the world. Just then, one of my supervisors came up to me and said that I could go home for the day. I was a little confused because it felt like she'd singled me out. So I kind of looked at her confused, and she said, well, we closed the Middle East library, and we just thought it would be easier and safer for you to go home too. Although her intentions were good, she made me feel different in that moment, and I felt that separation. And that fear, it came rushing back to me. Things kind of got worse after that. America went to war with Iraq. And although Iran had nothing to do with the war or the terrorist attacks, people just kind of confused Iran and Iraq. It sounded the same to people. So I found myself getting into a lot of political conversations with people and getting a little defensive because I didn't want to be associated with terrorism, the war, or any of the negative things that was associated with it. And I found myself educating people a lot again about the difference between the people and the government. But I was also competing with the media because it had such a strong hold over people. The entire Middle East was referred to as the axis of evil, and my efforts to humanize my people was becoming more and more difficult. I remember one day I was standing at the checkout line in the grocery store, and Iran had just suffered from a major earthquake in the city of Bam. Although it wasn't near anywhere my parents were or anybody that I knew, I was still heartbroken for the people of Iran and people of my country. The girl in front of me had this magazine, and it had a picture of the earthquake victims on it. As she was checking out, she put it on the counter, and the cashier looked at it, smirked, and said, "Serves them right, those stupid Muslims." And I don't know how to describe how I felt in that moment. A rush of anger and hurt came over me, and I wanted to scream at her from the top of my lungs that she didn't know what she was talking about, that she was wrong. But what good would that do? Just create another hateful impression and add to her already distorted perception of Iranians and Middle Eastern people. So I said, okay, maybe I'll just try to explain to her about how Iranian peoples are victims of their government. And, this whole speech I have been telling people this whole time. So armed with my speech, I waited in line till I got to her, looked her straight in the eye, and she looked at me and smiled and said, "How you doing today?" Oblivious. My anger melted away because I realized something in that moment. I realized that she was also a victim of fear, and a victim of the lies fed to her by the media. She was no different than the people chanting death to America who were also victims of the lies fed to them by their governments. So I did the only thing I could. I smiled back, remembering that 6-year-old girl inside of me who was beginning to understand ignorance, and I chose not to become a victim of it that day. Since then, I've seen so many people hold up hateful signs about immigrants, Muslims, and even refugees, and blame them and associate them with the actions of their governments and a few other terrorist organizations. People have stopped asking me where I'm from, and they've stopped asking me about Iran. I find myself wondering a lot what assumptions people have already made about me, and I worry that their curiosity's been replaced with fear of offending me or just fear in general. Everything that I have been through has made me realize who I really am and understand my mission and passion in life. As a filmmaker, I try to make people see that it may be easier to live in this world of black and white and assign the label of other to someone and use them as a vessel for all your fears and insecurities. But that's not the way we should be living. And if you're living like that, you're not free. We need to stop giving fear power by communicating and asking questions and not being so scared of offending each other all the time. Each of you here tonight, you have the power to affect change by just having a conversation outside of your comfort zones with someone who doesn't look like you or think like you, and listen with an open mind. As another Iranian poet wrote centuries ago by the name of Rumi, your task is not to seek for love, but to merely seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you've built against it. When I was 6 years old, my father gave me a choice, and I chose to open up my mind and realize the most simple truth, that we're all human beings. And ever since that day, my parents reinforced one of life's greatest lessons, that there's no countries, no boundaries, and we're all just people, hoping and wishing for the same basic human rights. If a 6-year-old has the power to open up her mind and realize that, then I know we all do. So let's break down those barriers together by listening, communicating, and educating each other, because that is the only way we'll ever get rid and get free of ignorance and fear. Thank you for listening.